Welcome back to the Burning Branches podcast.
This is something special.
Ooh, ooh, ski.
Welcome back to the Burning Branches podcast. My name is David, and joining me in the studio today are
Scott
And Christian.
Who is the faithful servant? What does it mean to manage the things that God has given us? And how do we take what we've been given and cause it to be an increase, to be a profit? And not just from a business sense, but from a personal sense, from your family, from your job, maybe from your relationships or your time. How do you cause an increase to come with those things? The Bible uses specific language, and it's translated from the ancient languages as the word steward. What does that word even mean? Where does that come from?
Well, to further understand the word steward, I think we need to know what this word is all about. Like good old Google tells us that stewardship means taking care of something, such as an organization or a property. But part of the etymology of the word stewardship is very interesting because it says stig word. This is an Old English word, and stig as a prefix to that specific word means a house. And so basically managing a house is the root word of stewardship. And I think there's so much to be said about that.
And to build from that, from what the English definition is, it's so interesting that that means to manage a house or to housekeep or to keep your house.
Yeah.
If you look at the Greek word that's being translated from, it's oikonomia. And we talked a little bit about this on the last podcast, but oikonomia is where we get the word economy. So it's interesting how one keeps your own house affects the economy, affects the society around you, the culture around you. It affects the flow of money, time, and people and culture in such a great degree. And I want to ask you a challenging question. And let's start there. Let's start with housekeeping. You know, that's an important place that everybody starts. How is it that you can be a good manager or a good steward in your house? Let me frame it this way. In what way has God been working on you since he's been working on you to become a better manager of your house, of your home? And I know we're single men. We don't have a wife yet. Praise God. Working on that one. We don't have children yet. Praise God.
Works on that one.
So even though
Sorry.
I can't.
Once I get going, man.
Oh,
Working
man.
on that one.
Thank you, Jesus.
We don't have kids. None of us have kids yet.
None of us, even though we don't have a wife or kids, we don't have a house. We're learning to be, whether through what we're observing or what God is teaching us, like how to manage ourselves and how to be a leader and how to manage the things before we obtain a wife and before we obtain children. God's teaching and working on us. So what's a way that God has really been helping you to steward or manage your house better?
I remember 3 months ago praying to God for wisdom.
Amen.
I remember praying to God 4 or 5 months ago for knowledge and understanding. I remember praying those specific prayers. And 3 months later, there's just one setback after setback, storm after storm, depression after depression, like hard times after hard times. And in those moments, I started to realize that I prayed for wisdom at some point, and God gave me storms to learn from. I prayed for knowledge at some point, and those storms gave me knowledge because God showed himself through that storm. And so part of stewardship is understanding that wisdom comes from God, and God-given wisdom comes from him sometimes bringing some storms in our life that will get our attention. And through those storms, you learn how to interact with people. Through those storms, you learn how to recognize God in those storms. And it's almost like the disciples in the ship. There's chaos going on. There's a storm. The wind is boisterous. The waves are carrying the boat. There's water coming into the boat. And Jesus Christ lays down in the boat asleep. The disciples had no clue the power that was laying with them on the boat. So Jesus Christ wakes up. He's like, wait, there's a feeling of you guys knowing my power, but you don't know the power and the authority that I have. You recognize my presence, but you don't know the power and authority that I have. And through those storms that happened in my life, I started to recognize the authority that God has in all those storms that happens in my life. And I do have a testimony with my school grades, and there was a lot going on, like relationship wise, podcast starting, and was serving the church, and family issues, learning to go to work, being a good steward of my job, learning to make money and all that, to pay the rent and all that. But still the same, God brought me success in my education this semester. And I think me recognizing that God is the giver of wisdom is something that puts me in the light of what true stewardship is.
Let me ask you this. How did that realization change the way that you were managing things? How did that realization shift how you were, when that realization of authority and that God had authority over everything, how did that shift the way you stewarded things?
I mean, it taught me not to look at the problem, but look at the solution in every single one of those situations. It might be so hard to look at the solution in those moments because our body has been built to recognize these physical stimulations. Like if your rent is due on the 5th or whatever, and you only have a set amount of money, and you have only 3 days to make that money, and you know that it's going to be impossible to make that money before that rent due. That is the physical manifestation of what you need to do before you can make the rent. But in God's economy, that doesn't make sense. That's something that he doesn't look at his economy the way we look at our economy. So it taught me to look at the solution and stop looking at the problem.
I think that can be a huge paradigm shift. That was something I was always told as a kid. I remember my dad would always tell me, he says, when you get old enough, you start working a job, never go to your boss with a problem. Always look at the problem, come up with the solution, and bring that solution to your boss. Be the guy that brings the solution. Don't be the guy that brings the problem. And even if it's the wrong solution, you're not the guy bringing the problems, But it's interesting how God is that person for us. And where we're like, man, I've got this problem and I don't have a solution. And God's like, well, here I am. And that changes everything, because when you have that ultimate reliability where God is in the mix, I hear it from various preachers and wise men where they say, don't magnify your problem. Don't cast a big light on your problem. Because if you're casting a big light and you're magnifying the problem, that's all you're going to think about. Magnify your answer. Where is your answer? Where's it coming from? And God can be that for you. And when you realize that he has the full authority and the final authority, everything just falls and snaps into place. And it's so much easier to manage what you've been given. And so let's zoom in on something you said, that even though when you were going through the storms and the trials that you were given, you were still able to be a good steward at your job. So let's explore that for a minute. How do you feel like you've improved since God's been leading you through these rough times? How do you feel like you've been improved to be a steward of your job?
I mean, working in the restaurant industry is not an easy thing, because basically the amount of people that walks into the place, and there are different amount of personalities, and the co-workers have different personalities, and your managers have different personalities. You got to work with every single one of them. And it's not just looking at your computer or working a software engineering job or working a data analysis job, or possibly you're behind the computer most of the time. This is like you're engaging with people on a constant basis. And one way that I think I've improved on that is just being the right image at work, and how me being the right image directs people to the God that I serve. It's like there's something different about this man based on how he talks, based on how he carries himself, based on how he's not stressed about the environmental conditions that's happening. Like the entire building will be going off or will be going crazy. Oh, we don't have this, we don't have that. Oh, this is happening. This guest just cussed this person out, or whatever the case is, and still being able to maintain a certain posture, because there's an image that I want people to see that will direct them to God. And I think there's something that God has helped me steward, or God has helped me manage, like maintaining a proper image that will lead people to God.
It's amazing what carrying peace with you will do to the entire atmosphere.
Yeah.
And people notice it too. People notice when you when you hold your peace. And I mean, there's times I'll see coworkers engaging in gossip or something like that, and I'll just walk away, and they notice it.
Yeah.
And then at the end of their conversation, I know they're not going to be feeling good about themselves. They're going to feel lousy, and I'm I'm not part of that.
Yeah.
Mm.
And they noticed that I walked away from that, and I hold my peace.
Mm.
So
I agree. Yeah, Scott, I'm with you on that one. I've experienced that too, where I've had coworkers in the past or managers in the past where, I mean, you can just tell where if I'm in a one-on-one conversation with them, the way that they might express their discontent with a particular situation is different versus when they talk to me, versus when they might talk to other coworkers. The language might be a little more vulgar if they're talking to a whole group, but they come correct when they're around me. And so just keep on doing that. And you're going to notice that change in people because they know the difference.
That's good. I've experienced that as well, in the work setting as well. But I do notice, like you said, people, they know who to go to gossip. They don't really want to come to you because you're not going to partake in it. So, that's good because you're shining your light. You let your light shine. And you don't have to say much about the situation. Just continue doing what you're supposed to do in a workplace. And I think people, they know.
Yeah, they definitely do. It's interesting how the Bible words it, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." He doesn't say they will be, although there's a kind of an assumed there. It's that other people will look and say, "Oh no, they are the children of God." How do we know that? Because they bring peace, and they make peace. And when you're carrying peace and you're speaking peace and you're not going to be a part of the things that disrupt the peace, it changes the atmosphere and environment. And I've heard at times where a certain workplace, I hear it's like, "Oh, this is a toxic workplace and it might be because of so-and-so, or and it's, there's all these people over here and they're making everything way more difficult and way more violent than what it is. And mentally speaking.
Right.
But when you bring peace into that situation, it makes everything just calm down. And then suddenly it's a more productive place. It's a more pleasant place to be. And you're actually adding something to that environment and atmosphere. And there's a value you're bringing just by carrying the peace in there. And when you carry that peace in there, it shifts the attitude of everyone that's interacting with it. And, I think we all have many testimonies, I'm sure, where we enter into a situation and it just changes, right? And is that not being a steward of the peace you've been given? Is that not it? Let's zoom in a little bit on, maybe it's a little vulnerable. Let's zoom in a little bit on the home. And we don't have to get super personal, but I can tell you when I was a lot younger and before I was fully living for God and before I was in full surrender and fully born again, I was very angry all the time. I just had this deep-seated anger, and I was in discontent. And I recently found out that my top love language is physical touch. And I realized, I was like, man, in my whole 20s, nobody's giving me a hug. Maybe that's why I was angry all the time. But on a real note, I was just mad. And I would enter a room, and it was like, I'm sure people felt daggers coming off of me. And I would enter, in a room with my family, and it's like, you could tell something was off. I knew they could. But it's like now I've watched some people that I love dearly and cherish in my life, and I watch them, and they bring peace in those situations. And God has ministered to me and shown me, like, you carry the same peace, and you need to let it exude. And the same way you used to carry anger, you can carry peace now. And I watch a grown man patiently handle some angry people and just turn it around on them. And I'm like, wow, we can do that. Like, we can just do that as men. We can just be patient, and we can give peace for anger. We can give peace, and we can stitch together, reconcile, and bind that was broken by just being patient and peaceful. And that can really hold a home together like nothing else can, just maintaining that atmosphere. Have you experienced anything like that where God has shifted your attitude, not necessarily about peace, but shifted your attitude in a way where you learned how to manage a home better and be a steward of the home that you've been given or that you will be given?
I mean, I think one of the first things that comes to mind is just understanding that along with your attitude and how you approach and handle certain people, there's also your actions within the home. And so knowing things about, how to upkeep the home and how this will impact the environment. Like,
Mm.
if you're working and you come home to an unclean house or an unclean environment or unkempt environment, that's not exactly going to be conducive for sparking good, healthy conversations. And so if you know that there's something that needs to be taken care of, if you're able to do it and you see it and you do that, that can be one step to creating a more conducive environment for having healthy relationships, healthy conversations.
It's amazing how the little things make a difference. Yeah,
Mm.
makes a huge difference.
Well, for me, I live alone, so I think like just coming home to peace like is great. And what I do for that is I pray or I'll listen to a sermon just because I am alone, so I have to do positive. I have to do positive things or else my mind will just wander. But like just pushing myself to do those things, just so when I'm not in that home setting, I can kind of take those things with me. And I feel like God has kind of like pushed me to learn different things. Just being creative on my creative side, like continually being productive, learning something, listening to a sermon or word or music, like constantly pushing me to do those things, even because I'm by myself. Nobody's going to tell me, hey, you need to do this. So just pushing myself to do those things. And that's kind of like how my home set is. But I love peace. Like,
Honestly, preserving that kind of an environment is valuable. It helps your mind really unwind and helps your mind go to the place you need it to go. And I think when you can take that piece and you can put it into a full home, a full family, so to speak, I think that's something special. That's like people work their whole lives to get to that point when they're like 60 years old and finally they figured out how to put that piece in their home. That's a good grandparent's home, because they figured it out. They know how to make their home that way. It takes a lifetime to get there. So the earlier you can start, I still haven't figured out that part.
I haven't completely arrived. Like, I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm just
I don't think any of us
yeah,
have.
I'm not. Because,
Fucking, the man's got candles lit.
I do like candles.
Communion ready.
I do like the candles and stuff. Like, that's my vibe. But, like, people have to have kids. Like, they work all day, and then they have their kids. They have to go get their kids. They're running around the house. Like, it's kind of hard to try to keep a peace, like,
Yeah.
Keep everything peaceful.
Yeah, got to keep a strong hand in these streets now. Cut that.
I won't speak on that.
I'll speak on it.
But no, I guess I can say, like, from my upbringing, it's pretty peaceful for the most part. With my family, I come from a Pentecostal background, so like I did go to church every week, and my parents instilled me to have good morals and yes ma'am, no ma'am. Like, they raised me well, so I can carry some of those things with me as I raise my family. Look to raise my family one day.
It's useful to have something to draw upon, and I think it's useful to have friends that even if you don't have it, you can look and see, like, oh, how are you managing things? Like, how can I be better? And you watch the people that you trust, and you're like, wow, you're a pretty good dad, or man, you're a pretty good husband, and you're doing a really good job. And to have those points of reference, it's super valuable, or super valuable, like coming from a background where you're like, you know what, my parents were doing a pretty good thing. Like, they were managing this pretty well, considering like what it takes to speak life into a home, or what it takes to manage a home, from your finances to keeping a peaceful atmosphere, keeping a good atmosphere, keeping a reverent atmosphere, while also having a breathing, living environment. It's a tricky balance sometimes. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah, it is. I think God has he has a tendency of allowing us to practice in private before he brings us out in public.
Yeah.
And is a beautiful thing. But all of us have to recognize those moments where, oh man, I think God is just allowing me to practice in private here before I come to the public state, or before I come to the place where it truly matters. And I say that because I used to not be the type to lay my bed, or tuck in the linens on my bed, or tuck in my pillows and stuff like that after I get out, or I used to not be that way, but just learning new habits. Like the first night I think about is just laying in my bed, lay in my bed, put my pillows up, and just those simple measures. I've heard a few people say that you're basically a product of your environment. And we've hit on this a few times in our podcast about how very important our environment is when it comes to the outcomes, that the products that we put out there. So like Suquita alluded to this when she came on the podcast, and she talked about
Episode 6, check it out.
absolutely. She talks about how some parents are just yelling to their kids all the time, and then no wonder they go to school and their kids start yelling to other kids. And the kids are yelling to other kids because their parents do that. So it comes right out of the environment. Now I have 4 or 5 men directly influencing my life, aside from my pastor and some of the men at our church. These people are directly influencing my life, and I have to know these moments of importance, that these are times God wants me to practice these things in private before it comes to the times where it truly matters. I'm not saying like hanging out with you guys doesn't matter, but we have to recognize those moments. Like say, if you're in charge of the kids, like I know Christian is he takes care of the Sunday school kids. Sometimes he's a teacher there. And just recognizing those moments where it's like, okay, God has given me an opportunity to learn how to communicate with these kids in Sunday school, because eventually I'm going to have some kids. Well, I don't know if you want some kids, Christian, but I'm going to speak it into existence. But yes, like God gives us this moment to practice in private before he brings us into public. And I'm recognizing every moment that God has given me where he wants me to practice in private before he brings me out into public. Like what if like the podcast is so good? You don't know where this is going to end up. We might have, Ben Carson, we might have Obama in here. And if we don't start practicing this way, how are we going to react when these big names come around? I don't know. But that's just how I think about these things when I recognize these little moments, like Joseph in the prison.
Or how about how you respect your mom versus how you're going to respect your wife? Or how about learning how to submit to your dad so you can learn how to submit to your pastor? If you have a good dad, if you have a good pastor, But these things, just like you said, it's like the little things in private teaches you how to handle the big things in public.
Yeah.
And there's a stewardship or a management of the household that is entrusted
Absolutely.
to the masculine figure to be able to say, well, you know what? I'm going to lead in this area. I'm going to lead by example. I'm going to lead by speaking life, by speaking peace. I'm not going to engage. What does the Bible say? It says, I encourage every man to lift up holy hands without wrath and without doubting. And somebody once told me, a woman actually once told me this. She says, what are men terrible at? She said, well, they all doubt and they're all angry. And I thought about it, and I'm like, I do doubt, and I am angry a lot. Like, why does that sound so familiar? But it's like those are the things that we can intentionally be like, I'm not going to speak in anger, and we can manage that household better. I can speak in respect, and I can also speak life, and I can manage these things in private, have an opportunity to leave before I cleave, like my brother always says.
I think stewardship is under attack as much as masculinity is under attack, especially when it comes to men. I say that because it's applauded, right? It's applauded when someone goes into the corporate world and brings a cup of coffee to their boss. Like, oh my God, you're doing such a good job, it's applauded when someone brings the mail to their boss or serves the corporate world. But it's so frowned upon when, so to speak, a mother decides to just stay home and take care of their kids. Like,
come on with it.
Why would it be applauded when I go out to serve the corporate world? Why is it so much applauded? There's a hand of applause. There's just commitment to come in. I'm bringing coffee to my boss. I'm picking up Starbucks and bringing it to my boss. And everyone loves it. Like, oh, this person is always here for 45 hours a week. I'm like, she's such a hardworking man. He's such a hardworking woman. Or whatever the case is, it's commended. But as soon as that's turned around to a point where this woman this man is just dedicated to his family, wants to bring much wisdom to his kids, like, then all these questions start
you're
to come
soft,
up.
or you don't
Right.
care.
Why? He says, is it a controlling relationship? Is the man telling you to stay home? Is the woman telling you to stay home? Like, all these questions come up.
Yeah.
So I think stewardship is being attacked in that way. There's so
Yeah.
many men that disregard their family because they just want to be in the work field all the time and leave most of the responsibility to the woman. And so, like, there's so many aspects of this accountability, the stewardship thing that needs to be attacked. And I know that it's such a thought-provoking conversation.
Let me respond to that too,
Yeah.
because that sparked a thought, and it's interesting that you said that in that way, because growing up, and I'll be completely open about my past, my mom was a stay-at-home mom out of choice, and she was always getting flack from all of her friends. Maybe not all of her friends. She was getting flack from a lot of family and friends. Like, well, why is your man not letting you go out and work? She's like, hey, let me work. He'll let me do whatever I want. Yep. I want to be at home. I want to take care of my house. I want to steward and manage these things. I want to teach my son. I want to do these things. And so she made a conscious choice, and people were always talking down to her or treating her as though she was selling herself out as less than.
Yeah.
But in reality, if she hadn't done that, I would not have half of the tools and skills that I have today.
Wow.
I would not have seen what a good home dynamic looks like, where somebody was paying attention and managing things. I would not have seen these things. And it's like our culture it values money, and then it doesn't value the family. So it's like, well, you're spending time with your family. Well, what's your rate of return on that? Well, my rate of return is enriching life, is building life, is speaking life. My rate of return is making sure the family's protected.
Peaceful home.
Peaceful home. And it's not all about money, but I think you're right. It's like everybody applauds when you're making money. Everybody applauds it when you're out there, like, oh man, my investment account and my 401k, and I'm getting all these benefits, and I'm working 80 hours a week, and it's like, wow, you're a hard worker. And then you look at it and you're like, oh, well, she's a soccer mom. And I was like, well, hold on just a minute. Like, before you start calling names and misunderstanding the situation, look at how much time this woman is investing in her home. Look at the things that she's doing. Understand how she's spending her time.
I'm with you on that one, David. I feel especially sometimes as men even, we have a tendency to look at the tangible things, the hard things. It's like, I'm bringing home this amount of money. I'm able to buy, these things. I'm able to provide these specific services or insurance or whatever for my family. And sometimes it's easy to discount their emotional health. It's easy to discount where they're at mentally. It's like, it's sort of like what you mentioned a couple episodes ago, how there are some kids who, grow up in these homes and they're provided, they have clothes, they have food, but they don't have anything emotionally. They're dead emotionally. They don't know how to interact emotionally. And because of that, now they're going out into the world and they don't know how to interact with people, or they don't know how to build those relationships that they need in the real world to survive.
I mean, even if they have the assets or to interact with the real world, they don't have an understanding as to the reason as to why family is important. They don't have the dynamics of having a mom and a dad present in their life, pouring into their life. They don't have that dynamics. That's something that I think is very important. I know that every single one of us can attest to that as well. Like, hey, my dad wasn't present, like, for a lot of my life. You know what I'm saying? Nah, there's nothing wrong with that, because he had to go out and do what he had to do. He had to come overseas because of his job to, learn all the trade that he needs to do to provide for his family. There's nothing wrong with that. Do I not like him for that? Absolutely not. I love my dad to death. No, I wouldn't be in existence without him. But it would be so much fruitful. I'm not saying that who I am now is not fruitful or whatever, to have that dynamic of a mom and a dad pouring into me. Like, would have been something special in that regard. And I was talking to one of my friends, well, I wouldn't call him like coworker, I should say. And I had this impression about this man until he told me something about himself, like he's like, oh, I have 6 baby mamas and 9 kids. And I turned around and I'm like, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in you. And not from a place of hate, not from a place of spite, or not from a place of bitterness, or whatever the case is, or looking down on him or anything like that. I still like the guy. But the level of not having stewardship in that, or not having anyone to say, hey, someone's got to stop you in your tracks. Like, at least the second baby mama, someone's got to stop you in your tracks, because there's no level of accountability, stewardship. Like, I'm responsible for this. And then my follow-up question was like, oh, so are you directly involved in every single one of those 9 kids? Well, I spent holidays with them, like Christmas. And it's like, it blows my mind. So the level of how people need to understand what stewardship is and accountability is, especially when it comes to the level of family, or when it comes to the level of relationships, is so important. I think it's super important.
Well, you created that, right? And if you created that, then you're in charge of it.
Absolutely. But people just don't get that. We live in a culture that kind of glorifies things that are not important. They glorify the fact that, oh man, I have a lot of girls, and I have a lot of girls in my network, and that's what's being glorified. It's like we don't glorify that 25-year marriage. We don't glorify the 30-year anniversary, the 50-year anniversary. All we glorify is the divorces that's happening. Oh, the celebrity divorce with this person. So that's the sight that the world see. That's what the world see all the time. And so a lot of these kids are growing up looking at marriage like, oh, this celebrity divorced this person. Zendaya and Tom Holland are not together anymore. All of this, that's what our kids are growing up looking at, and they're not looking at the long-term marriages that's happening. Like their news media or the media's not putting out these long-term marriages for the kids that are growing up to see.
Well, I was just gonna circle back to what you said at the beginning about how when you ask for wisdom and clarity, and God began to show you His sovereign nature and how His authority was the thing that strengthened things, and it's just amazing to me. It's just amazing to me when we see, like, when we put God in His proper place, He begins to glue the right things together, and He begins to bring people in the correct order. And I've been in situations where I didn't have God in the proper place in my life, and I couldn't get things to stick no matter how much I wanted to. And when we approach God and we say, you know what, I'm going to be the priest in my home. And by priest, I mean I'm going to handle the holy things, so that the mundane things, so that the important things, the physical things, the carnal things that need to be lined up, they all get lined up after that spiritual thing. And about when we have the proper authority flowing from God directly to us and say, you manage this thing. I've handed it to you. It changes our perspective when we understand that it's not mine. I've just been trusted with it.
Amen.
And but when you realize you're being trusted with it, and this changed my life, man. Maybe I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but when I listened to David Goggins, he said something. He said, my biggest driving force is that when I get to heaven and I look at my maker, He's going to hand me a list and He's going to say, this is what you could have been. And that shook me to my soul. And so now when I look at things, it's like, hey, David, these were the things that I gave you to manage. Let's see how well you took care of those. This was the woman I gave you. How well did you lift her up? How well did you help her? How well did you nurture her and give her the space to be the best creation that I made her to be? These are the children I gave you. What did you do to speak life into them? What did you do to grow them? What did you do to give them a taste for the things that they were supposed to become? What did you do to nurture them? And that's such a driving force when you understand the sanctity of the things you've been given. People don't understand the sanctity of what they've been given. They think, oh man, I just like this person. Yeah. And so I'm just going to cleave to them in marriage. It's going to be simple because we lived together and we did all these things, all these physical things and romantic things. And we went on these trips and we just really like each other. And, oh, that's great. But
there's more to it.
When you understand the sanctity, that's why when people say the sanctity of marriage is under attack, that means something. There's a sanctity there. And what's the sanctity is that God gave it to you.
What do you mean by sanctity, David?
I mean, sanctity is a holy set apart thing. And so when you're in covenant with somebody and you're cleaving with somebody, there's a holy covenant that's saying, God has trusted you. You've made the decision to take this thing. That's good. But now God is trusting you. You took it. Now take responsibility for it and do the best you can with it, because the sanctity is the holiness of it. And so there's a holiness to marriage. There's a holiness to family. There's a holiness to unity and peace. And these things change our world.
It does.
So talking about stewardship in the home and in the job and how we can manage the things that God has given us and how God is really preparing us and showing us. I really do think it's not something to be taken lightly for sure, but it's something to be taken with a joy, because there's a joy when you see the result of it. When you see the result of, like Darius said, like, I just like peace in my home. I'd like a good environment. There's a joy that you get out of that, There's a joy you get out of going into your job and saying, you know what, I'm going to be the best light that I can in this place. And then you see the result of that. And there's a joy you get. You're like, wow, other people were able to be helped. Other people were able to help themselves. Other people were able to take from that life and say, oh, you realize there's value there. And there's virtue that can flow just from being in a correct place mentally and spiritually.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful, though, like the results that come out of being a good steward. And for we men, like even our tongue per se, you know, that's something we can go in, like being a good steward of our words. And that's something that I know even with our conversations in the studio, learning how to embrace the silence, learning how to, you know, not talk too much, or learning to be very particular or very intentional with the words that you're saying. Because words are seeds, and seeds are what? Planted. When seeds are planted in the right conditions, they grow. It might not grow in the next month or 2 or 3. It might grow in 6 months or a year. And I remember having a conversation with this young lady, okay, and I've alluded to this maybe in our second podcast, our second episode. And this lady was just going through it. You know, I believe she was 17. She's going through it. So for some reason, she just opens up to me about whatever she's going through, you know, outside of work, family issues and stuff like that. And I took about 3-5 minutes to talk to her. I'm like, hey, you know what? If you could feel free if you want to talk to me about anything. Like just giving her that liberty to talk to me about these and just paying an ear to her. I didn't really have to say much at all, but just giving her that ear. 2 years later, this girl messages me, be like, Kenneth, you remember the specific day where you spoke to me at this time in this specific place? And I'm like, yeah, I do. Well, I had planned in my mind that I was going to end my own life if you hadn't spoke to me that day. And ever since then, the thought of what words come out of my mouth or what time I give to people, because you have no clue what the other person is going through. And having that mindset gives so much room to open up to what other people have to say and to pay respect to what other people are going through, regardless of what you know about them. So I think there's so much fruit that comes from being a good steward.
And I think that's it magnifies that same idea when you look at the home, because that home is that place of vulnerability. It's that place of growth. And so, you know, sort of how when you said a few episodes ago, how when you come into that environment and, you know, you've been out in the world and, you know, you've been affected by the world and someone said this to you and now you're angry, or now you're upset, now you feel a type of way, and you bring that into your home, like that's a vulnerable place. And if you're letting those emotions that you brought into the world into your home, that's going to affect everyone in there. And so that's why we have to be really careful. We have to be really intentional with the emotions that we bring in there, because it has the power. It has the power to change. It really has the power to change.
It's amazing. Well, thank you for coming with us on this journey as we explored the value of good management, good stewardship, and how we can take that and use that to virtue and value in our world. Don't forget to check us out on our Facebook page. There's going to be a post up today. Make sure to tell us if something sparked a thought in you. Share it. We want to hear from you. You know, if you don't want it to be public, send us a private message on our Facebook or our Instagram. Leave a comment anywhere you can to reach out, and we want to hear from you.
Follow us on Instagram at burning_branches.
Follow us on the Apple Podcasts, the Burning Branches. Leave a review on there. Greatly appreciate it.
Subscribe to the Burning Branches on YouTube. Leave a like and a comment.
We love you guys. See you next time.
Good.